Hey guys, HackerSploit here, back again with another video. And this video, as well as other videos on the same subject, we're going to be exploring the process of developing VBA macros for red teaming or offensive security, generally speaking. And this, as you know, sprung up from one of the videos that I made regarding the first phase of emulating Fin6, where we utilized a Metasploit module to automate the development of the Word macro document that was to be used for initial access. So this will be a long-standing series, or it's essentially going to consist of more than one video and go beyond just creating documents or macro-enabled documents for initial access. So to begin with, as the title suggests, we're getting started with the very basics. And again, for those of you who are familiar with this, you can skip this particular video. In the next set of videos, we'll be exploring, various things. So, reverse shells, droppers, creating VBA macro droppers, if you will, or utilizing PowerShell. There's quite a bit of stuff that we can do. So this is going to be offensive geared. However, this particular video will not have any offensive connotation, although I will highlight something towards the end. So to begin with, what is VBA? Well, VBA stands for, Visual Basic for Applications. What is it? It is an interpreted programming language that's developed by Microsoft that essentially allows users who are using, Microsoft Office to automate tasks, customize the functionality, and of course enhance productivity within the Microsoft Office suite of applications like Word, Excel, PowerPoint. So that begs the question, like with any programming language, what type of programming language is VBA? Well, VBA is an interpreted language, which means that the actual VBA code or your macro is executed line by line by the host application. This will either be Word or Excel at runtime. So there's no compilation or anything like that. And, this obviously differs from, the compiled languages where the code is translated into machine code by a compiler before the actual execution. There's some other characteristics that I think are important for you to know. One being the fact that VBA also supports elements of object-oriented programming. So that's why you'll see stuff like objects, properties, methods, and events, which at the end of the day allow you to write modular and reusable code. This will become apparent because, when we'll be doing things like calling functions or subroutines and stuff like this, it pretty much follows the object-oriented model. And so, a few more things you need to know about it. What is it used for typically, right? I'm not saying from an offensive perspective, but it is generally widely used for automating, as I mentioned, repetitive tasks, creating custom tools, analyzing data. It's actually used quite a bit there, and building automation. So if you've ever used an automated spreadsheet to do your tax calculations, then macros were used there. So that now takes us or brings us to the actual syntax and usage, as well as the development environment. So the great thing about VBA is it's very similar to other programming or scripting languages like Visual Basic and Basic itself, and pretty much utilizes a combination of keywords, operators, variables, and control structures. Now, for the development environment, you may not know this. If you have pretty much Office installed on your computer, each Office application that supports macros contains a built-in VBA integrated development environment, or an IDE, that can be used to write, edit, debug, and run VBA code, or macros, as we're going to call them. So that then begs the question, what on earth is a macro, leave alone a VBA macro? Well, in the context of VBA, macros are small pieces of code or scripts written in VBA that can be used for automation in conjunction with the Office suite of programs. So simply put, a macro is VBA code that's embedded in an Office document. Now, before we actually get into writing some VBA code, I need to give you some history of VBA, or macros as it were, in relation to the Office suite of tools or programs. So the VBA or macro functionality was introduced a while back, in the 90s, and in the late 90s, it began being, you started seeing, or Microsoft themselves started seeing that it was actually being abused. And the reason it was being abused primarily was because, in those days, the Office file macros or Office macros were automatically executed when you opened the document or the worksheet by default. So there was no prompt that prompted the user to enable or to run the macros, which was, in hindsight, looks like a pretty dangerous thing, but obviously they had to learn that. Now, as of Office 2003, I believe, this default execution of macros was changed or disabled. And as a result of that, macro-enabled documents would, inform users or prompt users, it'll firstly tell them that, hey, this is a macro-enabled document, but then would require them to manually execute the macros, essentially, taking the liability or responsibility away from Office or Microsoft themselves. In other words, what they were telling users is, we'll tell you that this is a macro-enabled document. Execution of the macros is entirely your responsibility. Now, in Microsoft Office 2007, they expanded on macro security by creating a new set of file formats that prevented macros from being embedded in the default file format or the new default file format. So in 2007, or with the release of that particular version of Office, they created the docx, the new docx file format, which does not allow the embedding of macros. So prior to that, you had your doc format and then your docm. Docm was the macro-enabled file format or extension. And then after 2007, or the release of Office 2007, you had docx. And of course, this applies to all other Office suite of programs. So if it's Excel, it would be, instead of XLS, it would be XLSX, right? So now you have docx, which is, standard compressed document format. You have .x, which is a compressed template format. If you're creating a Word template, you then have docm, which is the macro-enabled document format. And then .m, which is a compressed template format, and .m and docm are the only file formats, at least in the case of Word, that allow or permit macros, in terms of them being embedded in the document. So one final thing I need to just point out here, and I know this is quite a lengthy intro section, is that the extension or format it really does not play any role in the validation process. And this is because data validation is performed prior to opening an Office file, regardless of what file it is. So Office performs data validation through the data structure identification, or through data structure identification against the, I believe, what's it called? The Office Open XML standard. And this validation, this data structure validation or data validation is handled via the WWLIB DLL file, or the actual DLL. And final thing I need to mention, which I think is quite important, a lot of people don't get this, but changing documents that have the docm extension. So let's say you created a phishing document that of course has the docm extension. If you change it to something like docx, the macros will pretty much be stripped. So that's not a reliable strategy. And that's why as we progress in this particular series, as well as the other resource development series, in this one we'll be exploring ActiveX and stuff like this. So that brings us to the practical section. So I'm currently on a Windows 10 system. It doesn't matter, as long as you have a system, at least a Windows system that has Office installed, you should be good to go. We're not going to do anything malicious right now, but if you want to follow along, you can. So let's get started with the basics. I'm just going to close Word here, and we're going to use Word in this case. We'll obviously explore Excel and stuff like that. There really isn't any difference, or not much of a difference. But to get started, you want to open up Office, and this is, I believe, Office 2016, which should work. Pretty much any version from 2007 would work just the same, although VBA has different versions. But again, I don't want this video to take too long. So first things first, you need to go into options, go into customize ribbon, and make sure the developer tab is enabled, because that allows you to quickly access macros or the actual IDE, the VBA IDE, which you can actually access via keyboard shortcut. You then want to go into your trust center, and again, if you're doing this on your actual daily driver, make sure to disable this. I would highly recommend you do this within a Windows virtual machine, because we're going to be clicking on enable all macros. Now, again, this is dangerous, but this is a testing environment, and we want our documents to execute them without any of these notices right over here. So, disable all macros with a notification. That's when you get the enable content or enable macros banner at the top of the document, but we want to disable that for now. So once you've done that, just hit OK. And now I'm going to create a new document, and I'm going to save it as, I'll go and save it onto my desktop here, and I'm just going to call it, we'll just call it doc1, but now instead of docx, remember, we want to go for the macro enabled document format, which is docm. You can see the old document format was doc. Office 2007 comes along, and we have docx, which is that does not allow for macros, but there can be interesting stuff done with this one here, but I'll get to that. Anyway, docm, save it, and now for those of you who are familiar with macros, if you've worked with them before, you know that you head over into the developer tab and you click on macros. You can also access the IDE by using the Alt F11 keyboard shortcut, which will take you into the actual IDE. But we want to go into macros, and now we have the ability to create a macro. But we want to specify the macros in this current document, so we don't want to create global macros. So we now provide it with a name, and I'm just going to call this basic, very, very simple, or we'll call it basic VBA, something like this, and we click on create. Okay, so that'll take you directly into the IDE. Now, getting started, there's something you need to, I want to explain the structure of this particular IDE. So right over here, you have your code window, right? So this is where you write your macro, and then on the left you have your project explorer. So firstly, you have the normal project, which applies to this is essentially global configuration or macros, if you will. But then you have this project, which applies to the document that you're currently working on. And under modules, this is where you put your macros. So what is a VBA module? Well, a module in VBA is essentially just think of it as a container that holds your code. And this will, of course, include procedures, which are essentially subroutines and functions, variables, pretty much your macro, they'll be held in a module. You can have more than one module, or you can have a single one, doesn't really matter. So over here we have one called new macros, you can see, and we already have a declaration, a subroutine declaration here called basic VBA, which we created. So that's referring to that particular macro. You can also insert new modules by right-clicking on modules and then saying insert. You can insert a module or class module. So this is where the object-oriented aspect of VBA comes into play, but we'll not do that for now. So first things first, you can see that it presents us with a basic boilerplate here. And I'm just going to increase my font size so you can see this a little bit better. Just give me a second. All right, so there we are. Just increased it to the max. You can change this by going into tools, options, and then the editor format, where you can change the font size, the foreground color, background indicator, etc. for various aspects of the actual editor here. So the normal text, selection text, etc. So if you wanted to make it a dark theme, you can do that as well. So right over here, we're presented with two key aspects of the syntax. So you have subroutines, which are defined using the sub keyword, and then the name of the subroutine. So what is a subroutine? A subroutine is a block of code that it operates very similar to a function. If you've if you've programmed before. However, there's one key distinction, and that is that it performs a task but does not return a value, or does not allow for returning of values. You can also call them directly by name, in another subroutine, and they're typically, as I said, used to perform actions. So if we want to do something, you use a subroutine. Now, if you want to do something but require the ability to return a value, then you would use a function, and we'll get to that shortly. So first things first, you can see we also have comments here. So comments are denoted using the single quote. So if I wanted to type in a comment, I could say this is a comment, something like this, and that is a comment, but we don't need that right now. And you can see in terms of the syntax, when you start a subroutine, you also have to end it to, essentially tell the interpreter, when it starts and when it ends, obviously. Yeah, so this is what we have. For example, just to show you what we can do, we can use a message box. And I'll expand on this, but we can just say, this is a message, right? Or this is a subroutine in VBA, and that'll use the message box functionality. So we can now save, and you can use F5 to run or F8 to debug. So if I hit, F8 on my keyboard, I can then step through, and I can set breakpoints if I want, but we can just run it. And you can see this is what the macro does right over here. It just, brings up a message box and prints out the text there. So this is, subroutines and comments, as well as the message box functionality, if you will. So let's talk a little bit about functions, right? Because I mentioned them. So functions, again, work exactly the same as logically speaking, as a subroutine would. However, the only difference is that they return a value to the caller. The advantage of this is fairly obvious. Given the fact that they return a value, functions can be used in expressions or assigned to variables. So for example, I'm going to create, you'll just call this basic VBA here. We'll get rid of that. So we have a subroutine there. We're then going to create a function. You create a function using the function keyword. So function and then the name of the function. In this case, we're going to say add numbers, and then we're going to pass in we're going to specify the actual values to be returned. So we're going to say a as integer. So this is how, again, we've not yet got to variables, but I'm just going to declare them here. So a as integer, b as integer. So we're just going to add two numbers. This is an example I always use, and then the type is as integer, right? And then you can see the IDE automatically formats that for you, or you have completion there. So what we're going to do now is we're going to just say add numbers, and that's going to be equal to the expression a plus b. All right, so now you can see, this function allows for values to be passed into it, and then that function is ended there. Now in the subroutine here, we can say dim result. So we'll just create a new variable. You create variables using the dim keyword, and the type is specified like so. So as integer, the data type, and then we say result. So the variable result is going to be equal to, and then we call add numbers, and then we pass in the values we would like to add. So I can say 10 and 30, or 10 and 40, right? Something like this. And then we can say message box. We can use the message box right over here, and syntax is very important, or the case. And we can then say, the sum is, and we can then concatenate, very, very similar to other languages. So we'll say result. And now we can include, or we can start to add some color to the message box. But before we do that, let's just save it, and I'm going to run it now. So it's going to ask us for the macro we want to execute. So we'll just hit run, and you can see the sum is 50. Now, what if we wanted to change the message box title or heading here to something else? Well, in order to do that, we can specify a few more parameters here, where we essentially define the message box. So we can call upon VB information and then specify what we want as the title. So we can just call this adding numbers, something like this. And then we can hit run, and there we are. You can now see the title is now, adding numbers, and we get that there. So obviously now this brings us to the whole point of the subroutine execution and calling subroutines. So, we can have more than one subroutine or function, and the question is, how do we call them? So what I'm going to do now is, let me get rid of that, and we're going to delete this function right over here. So still under the subroutine basic VBA. So let me create another one. I'm just going to call this sub, or we can just change the name here. Hold on a second. Let me get rid of that. We can just change this to, let's call it first procedure, something like this. And then we're going to create another one. So sub second procedure. And I'll explain a little bit more about the execution of macros. And then we can utilize a message box here to say second procedure was called. All right. And in here to call it, we have to say call second procedure. If there were any values, we would specify them, but these are not functions. So we hit run, and you can see the second procedure was called. Now, if we don't call and we hit run, you can see nothing happens. And I'll explain why this happens. The best place to start is to mention that VBA does not have, like, in other programming languages, the main function or, procedure. And what that means is that execution must start or will start from either a call to a procedure like we did here, either manually, via the immediate window, or through a button. And of course, this is limited just to VBA, or through event handlers. And I'll speak about the event handler that is typically used by red teamers, or at least in the context of malicious macros, to essentially get the macro to execute when the document is opened. Of course, if the target has macro security enabled, they will still, be prompted with the yellow ribbon or banner at the top asking them explicitly as to whether or not they want to run the macros or enable macros. So hopefully that makes sense. Now, I don't want to get too bogged down into this at the moment, because we'll be exploring this, in the next videos when we're actually creating actual VBA macros for, red teaming or whatever. But I want to talk a little bit about variables, because I sort of brushed over them. But, variables are fairly easy to understand, and hopefully I can breeze past this really quickly. So as I mentioned a couple of minutes ago, variables are declared using the dim keyword, right? So just simply like that. Now, variables can be declared explicitly. However, that's really not recommended. So that's what you'd see in something like Python, where, I can create a variable 1, or, in this case, we can just call it my variable, and I can say that's equals to 10. That's an implicit declaration, which, again, pardon me if I said that explicit declaration is not recommended. It's implicit declaration that is not recommended. So this is implicit declaration. So I'll just use a comment there. And of course, my syntax, I'm so used to writing Python. I have to go back to my my old, one second, what am I doing there? I'm using, want the single quote. So implicit, actually you can, my bad. So there we are. Yeah. So anyway, I'm just going to cut that, and there we go. All right, so that's implicit. Then of course you can have, actually let me just call this var a, Then you can have explicit declaration, which is the correct way. So this is where you say, in this case, did I indent correctly? Yes, I did. Okay, so this is where you say dim, and then we can say variable b, and then you specify the data type. In this case, it's going to be an integer. We'll just, as an example, and then you can specify the value or assign a value. So I can say var b is going to be equal to 20, right? Fairly simple. Now you can also create local variables. You can create local variables or global. So if you want local variables local to a specific subroutine or function, then you can essentially do that by saying dim local. I'll just create one here called local variable as string. That's the other data type. So I'll talk a little bit about data types, but for now, and then I say local var is going to be equal to, and then a string value. So I can say local variable. Okay, so that's variables, how to declare them. And then of course, if you're doing global variable declaration, then you would essentially declare it at the top of a module. So for example, before I get into a procedure or subroutine, I should say, so you'd say public global variable as string, okay, and you can then assign it to the value. So if you wanted, or you can call it in here. So for example, I can say global variable is equal to Alexis, like so, and then I can say MsgBox VB info, and just say right over here global variable. Okay, there we are. So that's global, and then local as well. So hopefully that makes sense. Now for the data types, you have the integer, you have the long, single, double. You can also do currency. Then you have string, boolean, very useful, date, and the objects. Now I'll get into objects in the next set of videos, because they essentially relate to the features and functionality within Office itself. But now let's move on to some final set of examples around printing text or manipulating text, if you will. And then we'll talk about user input, and then finally some key event procedures in VBA, like auto open and how they're used, and you'll see the importance of that. So let's talk a little bit about printing or using the message box, which I've already shown you. So I've also shown you how to specify the message with a title. But now let's say I want to just create a new subroutine here, and we'll just call it message with buttons. Okay, and we'll create a variable called response as integer, and then I'm going to say response is equal to MsgBox, so user input. So we can say, do you want to continue? Something like this, right? And then we can then utilize VB yes no for to essentially provide us with a prompt there. So VB yes no, and then plus VB question, and then we just say confirmation. You'll see what this means shortly. And yeah, don't think we need to include anything there. Hold on. Yeah, single quote. We want a double there. Okay, and then we can say, we can now explore some control statements. So for example, if statements. In this case, we would need one. It's very simple. So we say if response is equal to VB yes, then do the following. If I can type correctly today. So then. And then we say MsgBox, and you can use MsgBox with brackets here, or without them. It really doesn't matter. So we can say you chose yes. Okay, so something very stupid and simple like this, and then else. You chose no. You chose no. All right. And then to end the if statement, we say end if. This is required. So now we run this and you can see, do you want to continue? We have two options, yes or no. That is why we utilized VB yes, no, and then, VB question. Then we specified the title here, which is confirmation. So we say yes, and then you chose yes. Very, very simple, very powerful, as you can see. I don't think, for those of you who are new to this, I'm pretty sure you didn't know just how powerful VBA is, or, the only constraint is that it's just limited to the Office programs, but that's why we have VBS. Anyway, that's getting ahead of what I wanted to talk about. So we can also, utilize, a combination of icons and buttons. So, for example, I'll just create a new subroutine here called, we'll just call it advanced message or something stupid like this. And in here we can say MsgBox, and we can say, if I wanted an error or, critical error, I can say something went wrong or something to that effect. And then we can say VB critical. And in terms of our options for the user and what they can then respond with, we can say VB OK only, I believe. VB, let's see, was it VB OK only? Yeah, it was VB OK only. And this is not supposed to be another option. My bad. So VB OK only. Yeah, I know that. Thank you very much. And then we just say error or something like this. So we run it and you can see something went wrong. So there's a lot of stuff you can do that, utilizes Windows or allows you to, utilize the GUI or GUI elements. Now, let's take a look at a few more cases or examples revolving around, user input. So if I wanted to utilize an input box, I could say I'll create a new subroutine here called input box. There we go. And then in here, we'll create a new variable called username, and we'll say this is a string. And then we say username. Variables need to have the correct name. And then we can say input box. And then in here, we say, what our message is. So what is your name? And then user input. And then we, sorry, my bad. No, we don't want that there. So what is your name? And then we want to close this there. And we should be good now. And then we can say MsgBox. And we can say hello. Let's see, space, and then concatenate username and let's include an exclamation mark there as well. All right, so let's try this here. Where are we getting input box? Oh, my bad, input box. We have the same name there, so we can say input box example. Yeah, go ahead, run it, and now you can see I can say my name is Alexis. Actually, it should, yeah, made a mistake there. My mistakes always. So Morpheus, hello Morpheus. So a lot of stuff you can do. We've talked about control statements. I think one more we can do is a loop. I know this video is getting long, but this will be the last time it does. So we can say sub. We'll go with the classic printing numbers example. We'll go with a for loop here. So we'll say dim I, that's our counter, is integer, obviously. And then we say for I is equal to 1 to 5. So this is how you say the range. And then we say MsgBox. We want to print it out. And then we say a number. And we just add the counter there. And then, of course, we need to, we actually need to switch or increment. So we're going to say next I for our counter. Okay. Run this here. Number 1, number 2, number 3, number 4, number 5. There we are. Very, very simple. Okay, a few more things. The auto run and not auto run, the auto open and the open document event procedures. So what I want to show you now is, so you can see that when we run this macro, this is what you see, right? It displays this. Actually, we probably want to get rid of this and just use a very simple message box and just say macro executed to tell us, you know, if the macro has been executed. So we'll just keep it simple. So I run this, there we are, macro executed. Okay, so I've saved it. Let me close the editor and I'm going to save the document and I'm going to close it. So what happens when I try and open up this document? Will the macro execute? No, it doesn't. Now, even if I went into options and I went into the trust center and I said disable all macros with notification and I hit OK, close this up and I open this up again, you can see enable content, but the macro doesn't run. Now, why is this? Well, either, as I mentioned earlier, a specific subroutine hasn't been called, or, and this is the really key thing, we aren't using the auto open and open document event procedures that essentially allow us to, when the macro is executed, to automatically execute a macro, so we can actually utilize those predefined event procedures. There's a correct way and an incorrect way. So I'll just show you. We're going to macros here again. So print numbers, edit. So I can have this here. And then what I can do is at the top of the of this module, I can just say sub auto open. Okay. And we'll just hit enter. There we are. Okay. Now I've saved it. Let me close this up. And I'm going to open up the document again. In this particular case, let's see, does that bring up anything? Okay, it doesn't. Excellent. So let me go ahead and let me go into this one here. So if we now call it, so I can say call print numbers, and now let's exit. There we are. So this specific event procedure is extremely useful in that sense. Now, you can also just avoid creating other subroutines or functions and just do your stuff within auto open. And you can have another function called, or subroutine called auto open, because it's predefined. So, I can just say MsgBox executed with auto open. Okay, very simple. Save it, exit, and then run this here. There we are. So you can actually put all your malicious stuff in auto open if you want. Now, there's also open document, which is similar. And this is triggered when a document is opened. And there really isn't any preference. I personally find that auto open is more reliable. There's also ones specific to Excel, which we'll probably explore in a later video. But yeah, one final example I want to, or one final macro I want to show you, just to pique your attention here, is one that will get Windows system information and display it back to us. So what we'll do is we'll get rid of auto open here, and I'll just create a subroutine called system info dumper, something really vague. And then we'll create a new variable called object shell. And again, I'll explain what objects are probably in the next video, but it's a data type. And then dim, we'll create a new variable here called execute command as object, and we'll then create another one. So dim output line to handle output, and then dim system info as string. All right, now we'll use comments a little bit here now. So we're gonna create the shell object. All right, so I'm going to say set object object shell to an actual object, in this case create object, and we're going to utilize the W script. So W script dot shell, and I'll explain that, as I said, in the next video. For now, just want to show you how cool VBA is, especially when we're talking about Windows. Really execute the system info command that I'm sure you're all aware of. We can then say set this to object object shell and exec, and then we specify what we want to execute. So cmd.exe command system info. So that's where we're specifying our command prompt command. And now we want to read the output, or get the output as string. And we're going to use a while. So do while not exec cmd dot standard output at end of stream, and then we say output line is equal to exec cmd dot standard output read line. Okay, and then system info, the variables, is going to be equal to system info and output line. And then we're going to utilize, I'll probably explain this VB. This is line carriage, so CR for next line, and then we need to say loop. Okay, and then we're going to just say display system info in MsgBox. Okay, very, very simple. And then I'm just going to say MsgBox here. That's system info, and then I'm just going to say VB information, and say right over here the title is just system information. Okay, let's save this now, and we run this, and there we are. So you can see it gets all that info, and in my opinion passes it quite well, although not the best. And it's not everything, so you're probably much better off saving this into a file. Anyway, that's pretty much all I wanted to highlight in this video. Now that we know what we're doing, we're now going to take a look at practical examples. So, in the next video, most likely command and program execution with shell and W script, or, W script, and then we'll take a look at building a dropper, and then reverse shell macro, all that stuff. So that's going to be it for this video. And if you have any questions, comments, or feedback, leave them in the comment section. If you enjoyed this video, found value in it, leave a like down below. And I'll be seeing you guys in the next video.